This episode was requested by a listener, Crystal, on Facebook. If you'd like to request a topic or ask us a question, you can find us on facebook.com/morbidcuriositypodcast, on Twitter @morbidpodcast, and on our website, www.morbidcuriositypodcast.com. The Morbid Curiosity Podcast continues to be sponsored by audible.com. If you're busy like me, but you still want to read up on all sorts of morbid history or keep up with the latest science fiction and fantasy writers, Audible is the way to go. There are over 180,000 titles to choose from, and you can listen to these audiobooks on your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or other MP3 player while you work, cook, on your commute, or at the gym. MCP listeners can get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial by going to www.audibletrial.com/MCP. If you sign up for the free trial, you get a free audiobook that is yours to keep, and the MCP gets the funding it needs to keep bringing morbid history to your ears. I have some recommendations of books you can find on Audible on the subject of today's episode, but I'll get into those later. For now, on with the episode. Humans are fascinated by gore and violence, but even more so the mysterious and unsolved. This interest in disturbing and unpleasant subjects is called morbid curiosity, and it has gripped hundreds of people throughout the ages. I am one of those people. My name is Hallie, and this is the Morbid Curiosity Podcast. Haunted houses are a mainstay of paranormal activity, horror fiction, and urban legend. Perhaps someone died within the house, or some sort of dramatic or violent event occurred there. There are hundreds of houses that people claim are haunted, sometimes just because the house seems creepy, or perhaps its owner is odd, or acts in unconventional ways. One house that has been rumored to be haunted since the land it's built on was purchased is the Winchester Mystery House. The Winchester Mystery House is a Victorian-style mansion in San Jose, California. It was once the personal residence of Sarah Winchester, the widow of William Wirt Winchester, the man behind the Winchester Repeating Rifle Company. The mansion is renowned for its immense size, its many architectural curiosities, and the strange behavior of its builder, Mrs. Sarah Winchester. The house is said to contain over 160 rooms, with the exact number being unknown. This is because there are rooms built into rooms, and some that have been boarded up and hidden behind other rooms. There are doors that open into nothing but walls, a staircase that leads to nothing but ceiling, doors that open to sheer drops down into the kitchen or outside, spiderweb patterns on the windows, Y-shaped staircases, winding staircases with steps that are only 2 inches tall, and many rooms with features purposely set to equal the number 13, such as 13 steps in a staircase, 13 windows in a room, 13 panels in the ceiling, 13 panes in the windows, and 13 holes in a sink drain. There's also a grand ballroom made completely without nails, several chimneys that stop before they go through the ceiling, tiny doors to large rooms, and large doors to small spaces. Mrs. Winchester also had certain features specifically created for the house, such as the windows, doors, and paneling. She also commissioned several stained glass Tiffany windows, some of which were either never installed or put in spaces backed by walls so the light would never show through them. Besides all of these oddities, the house also boasts several innovations that were considered brand new technology at the time the house was built. There were elevators, hydraulic and electric, some of the first gas lights controlled by button switches, the first use of wool as insulation, the first indoor crank that opened outdoor windows, and a floating foundation to prevent massive damage during earthquakes. The legend goes that the strange construction of the house is due to a curse upon its owner, Sarah Winchester. Since its construction in the 1880s, the mansion and Mrs. Winchester were said to be haunted by the spirits of those that had been killed with Winchester rifles. Sarah Pardee and William Winchester were married in 1862 in New Haven, Connecticut. Mr. Winchester and his father were the owners of the Winchester Repeating Rifle Company and the inventors of the repeating rifle, a long-ranged gun that could fire once every 3 seconds, a revolutionary speed for the time. It was called the gun that won the Civil War because the Northern government commissioned so many of them to be used by their army. In 1866, Sarah gave birth to Annie Pardee Winchester, but sadly, the infant died months later due to a wasting disease called marasmus, which caused her to be extremely malnourished. Sarah took the death extremely hard, as any mother would. 15 years later, in 1881, William died of tuberculosis at the age of 43. This is the point where legend says that Sarah Winchester lost herself in grief and spiraled into madness. The story goes that she visited a psychic medium named Adam Coombs in Boston, who channeled the spirit of her deceased husband. The medium told Mrs. Winchester that the spirits of all those killed by her husband's rifles would haunt her forever unless she started building a house. As long as construction continued, she would be safe. Another version of the story is that as long as she continued building, she would never die. Either way, it's said she followed the medium's instructions to California, where she bought an uncompleted farmhouse and over 100 acres of land. She hired a foreman named John Hanson and began expanding the house. Each day, she supposedly came to John with a new plan for building, but no blueprints. These plans were rumored to come to her during her nightly séance in the central room of the house, a process which began with the ringing of a bell at midnight to call the spirits, and another at 2 a.m. to dismiss them. She was also said to have an elaborate method of coming and going to the séance room, traveling the labyrinth of her house in order to lose the spirits that followed her. Another part of her supposed efforts to confuse the spirits was sleeping in a different room every night. The sound of hammers 24/7 was said to give Mrs. Winchester peace, so work went on 365 days a year. Her workers were paid double the usual fee, but any disagreement with her could end in dismissal. They were also supposedly never allowed to see her without her veil. Despite these oddities, her workers were very loyal. Mrs. Winchester was able to afford this constant construction because of the large inheritance she gained from her husband and the share of his company that she owned. This amounted to an allowance of around $1,000 a day, which in today's money is about $20,000. It's estimated that in total she spent around $5.5 million on the mansion. At its peak, the mansion was said to be 7 stories tall, but during the San Jose earthquake of 1906, the house shook so violently that the top 3 floors were badly damaged. The story goes that Mrs. Winchester was so afraid that the spirits were punishing her for building too high that she stopped construction in that area of the house altogether, sealing the uncompleted rooms off and leaving them unfinished. Also during the earthquake, she was trapped in one of the rooms, one that is now called the Daisy Room, for hours before anyone found her, which must have added to her fears. Mrs. Winchester herself was perceived as odd by her neighbors and the other people that made up the high society of the area. She was reclusive and never wanted any visitors. She even supposedly turned away Theodore Roosevelt, who had heard of her strange house and tried to pay her a visit. She was said to always wear black and a veil and gloves so that her face and hands would never be seen. Sarah Winchester died in 1922. Her death was even mysterious, as it supposedly occurred when construction paused for only a moment, when all of the workers all took a break at once. Construction work ceased immediately upon her death. This is the legend behind the Winchester Mystery House. It was sold to a local investor for only $135,000, not long after Mrs. Winchester's death. It was considered worthless by appraisers because of its oddities and unfinished nature. Not long after the house was purchased, it was leased to John and Mamie Brown, who would later buy the house. In 1923, only 5 months after the death of Sarah Winchester, the house was opened to the public for tours, with Mamie as a guide. It was Harry Houdini who dubbed it the Winchester Mystery House during his visit to the already famously odd mansion. Today, the house is owned by Winchester Investments LLC, a private company representing the descendants of Mr. and Mrs. Brown, and several public tours are available to people who want to visit. The house was kept mostly the way Mrs. Winchester left it. Some modern additions include a topiary or pruned shrub in the shape of the number 13, and every Friday the 13th, the bell is rung 13 times at 1300 hours, or 1 p.m., as a tribute to Mrs. Winchester and her favorite number. In 2016, a new room was discovered in the attic. Inside was a pump organ, a Victorian couch, a dress form, a sewing machine, and several paintings. This room has now been made available for public viewing. This year, the Mystery House debuted its first daytime tour in 20 years. It's called the Explore More Tour and takes visitors to never-before-opened spaces in the house, many of which were left unfinished at the time of Mrs. Winchester's death. The legend of Mrs. Winchester is a spooky one, with both tragedy and mystery. Many writers have said she left no documents behind, nothing to explain why she did what she did, but that's not strictly true. By digging a little deeper, the life of Sarah Winchester and the evidence for why she continuously built a house with strange features begins to unravel the legend and reveal a woman who just wanted to be left alone. Sarah was born in New Haven, Connecticut, as Sarah Burns Pardee, to an upper-middle-class family. Her father was a craftsman and moved up the social ladder by selling ambulances to the Union Army during the Civil War. Young Sarah was considered a child prodigy. She was beautiful, intelligent, spoke 4 languages, was well-read in classic literature, and a brilliant pianist. She was dubbed the Belle of New Haven by the rest of New Haven society. She was also admitted to Yale University's only female scholastic institution at the time, the Young Ladies Collegiate Institute. There she excelled at science and math and was immersed in an atmosphere of scholarship. Her future husband also attended Yale, but they met at New Haven First Baptist Church. They were married for 4 years before their daughter was born and then died. 12 years later, William's father died, giving him sole ownership of the Winchester Repeating Arms Company. Only a year after that, William himself died. Sarah was said to be broken by so much loss in such a short period of time, but there's no evidence she went to a medium to try and contact her deceased husband. Even if she had gone to a medium, at the time this wouldn't have been that unusual. Spiritualism, a set of beliefs surrounding ghosts, mediums, and the afterlife, was coming to its peak during this time, especially with people of higher social status, like Mrs. Winchester. Spiritualism had no canonical texts or formal organization, but spread its message through pamphlets, tours, lectures, and of course, mediums. The message was threefold. Spirits of the dead had the ability and desire to communicate with the living. The afterlife or spirit world was not static, but a place where spirits continued to evolve and become more learned. And these spirits can be contacted or channeled through those that are open to them, mediums. Accusations of fraud weakened the spiritualist movement at the turn of the century, but the practice still exists in small pockets. The Victorian culture of England was also in vogue in the United States during this time. This was a highly moral and religious cultural movement with much ceremony and social obligation, yet romanticism and mysticism were also a large part of it. Paranormal events, such as seances, were a form of entertainment, as were grand social events where propriety reigned. Manners, proper reception of guests, and sticking to social obligations were what people were judged by. In the midst of all of this, there was Sarah Winchester, trying to cope with the loss of her child and husband. The black clothes she always wore signified that she was in mourning, even long after her loved ones had died. She was described as reclusive, meaning she preferred to stay in her home away from other people. It's possible Mrs. Winchester suffered from what we now call complicated grief, also known as persistent complex bereavement disorder. The symptoms include avoiding social contact, a heightened focus on reminders of lost loved ones, and hallucinatory experiences, such as imagining the dead are still alive or hearing their voices. Despite her grief, she was expected to receive guests, go to social events, and hold her own. Perhaps an episode of hallucinations started a rumor that she spoke to the spirit of her husband, and the rumor mill that is high society wove a tapestry of myth around that odd Mrs. Winchester who never received visitors. It's possible she kept her house under construction for the same reason, so that it stayed unfit for visitors. Evidence of this last theory is present in a letter she wrote to her sister-in-law, that even after 10 years of building, the house wasn't quite situated for visitors. This correspondence and much more was discovered and recorded by Mary Jo Ignafo, who published a book in 2010 called Captive of the Labyrinth, Sarah L. Winchester, heiress to the rifle fortune. In her book, Ignafo, who used documents such as letters, scrapbooks, and photo albums she discovered in the archives at History San Jose and Stanford University, reveals the human behind the legend of Mrs. Winchester. She states that Mrs. Winchester always wore a veil and gloves because she was missing teeth and had gnarled hands from severe rheumatoid arthritis. Her arthritis might also account for the so-called switchback steps in the mansion, a set of steps that zigzag back and forth and are made up of individual steps that are only 2 inches tall. These would have been much easier for her to traverse if she had trouble moving around. Ignafo also revealed that in another letter, Sarah Winchester told family in New Haven that she often stopped work on her mansion for months at a time in order to, quote, take such rest as I might. Ignafo's book makes me think that perhaps the rumors about Mrs. Winchester, most of which do originate to the time she was alive, were started by neighbors or other society members whose friendship was discouraged by Mrs. Winchester. Roy Lieb, the son and law partner of Mrs. Winchester's attorney, stated in 1925 that Mrs. Winchester was sane and clear-headed, with a good grasp of business and finance, and that all the superstition about her was made up. If we think about the rumors critically for a moment, they really don't make sense. Mrs. Winchester was supposedly controlled by spirits and tried hard to run from them, but she also supposedly called out to them every day for advice. That's a contradiction. Also, she supposedly built the house with all its oddities in order to confuse the spirits, but weren't they supposedly giving her instructions on what to build next? That's another contradiction, making it more likely these stories are just that, stories to entertain and intrigue. If she really believed that the Winchester fortune was cursed blood money, why would she hang on to it and spend it at all? Why not get rid of it and leave the curse behind? Mrs. Winchester did donate a lot of her money to her favorite charities. She endowed a medical center at Yale, now known as the Winchester Chest Clinic, and the fact that it focuses on diseases of the chest makes me wonder if she hoped to help save others from a similar fate to that of her husband, as tuberculosis is a disease of the lungs. Similarly, when she was young, her father had trouble finding work as a carpenter, and it's possible this influenced her to keep workers employed as much as possible by continually having projects for them and also paying them at a higher rate. Some of the oddities in her house can also be explained without supernatural elements. Earthquake damage could explain the staircase to nowhere. If the level above was damaged, the stairs may have led to one of the rooms she sealed off and then moved on. This could explain some of the chimneys that stop at the ceilings as well. There are also several clear glass doors on unfinished bathrooms that may reflect Mrs. Winchester's attempt to avoid being trapped and undiscovered if another earthquake were to hit. Even though there appear to be some logical explanations for the way the house was designed, there are also some more colorful explanations. Richard A. Wagner points out that Yale University had an environment full of Freemasonic and Rosicrucian philosophy. He proposes that Sarah Winchester, being the intelligent woman that she was, may have been influenced by Masonic encryption practices, such as numbered cipher systems. Wagner believes Mrs. Winchester's house is a puzzle she was crafting even before she built it. He suggests the labyrinth of the mansion reflects the initiation rituals of the ancient Eleusinian mysteries. The Eleusinian mysteries were annual initiations into the cult of the goddesses Demeter and Persephone, based at Eleusis in ancient Greece. The rites, ceremonies, and beliefs were kept secret from the uninitiated. For those that were initiated, the rebirth of Persephone symbolized the eternity of life, which flows from generation to generation, and that acquiring this knowledge would inspire rewards in the afterlife. Fun fact, as the mysteries involved visions of the afterlife, some scholars believe that psychedelic drugs were involved in these rites. The labyrinth was one of these initiation trials, forcing the initiate to hone their skills of insight and intuition in order to complete it. Mrs. Winchester's labyrinth was more symbolic. Wagner believes she left clues to solve her cipher puzzle throughout the house, using Sir Francis Bacon's numerological methodology. According to Wagner, Sarah Winchester associated the number 52 with William Winchester. There are 52 skylights in total in the house. She and her family were buried in Plot 52 of New Haven's Evergreen Cemetery. Wagner also states that their gravestones bear coded inscriptions: Baby Anne, SLW, and WWW, which, in addition to being initials and names, according to Pythagorean cipher, add up to 52. Wagner's overarching theory is that Sarah Winchester was inspired to create a multi-layer puzzle for later generations to decode. Her house is the puzzle, and we can only discover its meaning by following the path of an initiate, walking the halls and looking for ciphered clues. The explanation might be more simple: a grieving woman doing her best to avoid socializing, while also experimenting with design and architecture. While many parts of the house are odd, others are beautiful works of art and feats of engineering. That sounds like a lot of the piles of projects and papers on many people's desks. Most of them are half-finished, but others are testaments to hard work, research, and follow-through. This is my theory, but I've only been researching Mrs. Winchester for a week, so feel free to form your own opinion. You'll have an easier time forming that opinion if you read more about Mrs. Winchester and her mystery house. There are hundreds of books and websites out there that elaborate on the legendary aspect of the house. These are fun to read, but there are a few evidence-based books that I want to recommend. The one I found to be the most helpful and enlightening was Mary Jo Ignoff's book, Captive of the Labyrinth, Sarah L. Winchester, Heiress to the Rifle Fortune. As I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, just for MCP listeners, Audible.com is offering a free audiobook download and a 30-day trial. You can download Ignoff's book or any other audiobook from their massive collection to keep for free, whether or not you keep the service, by going to www.audibletrial.com/MCP. You're going to want to keep it though, because there are so many awesome audiobooks on there. Once again, that's www.audibletrial.com/MCP to get your 30-day trial and free audiobook. Getting a free trial also supports the MCP, so I highly recommend it. The Mystery House has spawned numerous spooky documentaries, one of which you can find for free on YouTube, called Mrs. Winchester's House. It's from 1963 and is narrated by Lillian Gish. I like this one because for some reason it reminds me of old Twilight Zone episodes. Very dramatic and very embellished, but entertaining nonetheless. I'll post the link on Facebook and Twitter after this episode goes live. CBS Films is producing a supernatural thriller called Winchester, due out in 2018. The film stars Helen Mirren as Sarah Winchester and follows the more supernatural version of the Winchester Mystery House story. Stephen King's television miniseries Rose Red was inspired by the Winchester Mystery House. In summary, an unorthodox university psychology professor leads a team of psychics to a massive Seattle mansion known as Rose Red in an attempt to find scientific proof of paranormal phenomena. The mansion is publicly thought to be haunted, and the interior of the house appears to change or increase in size on its own. Several works of literary fiction have been inspired by the Mystery House. In the novel The Vor by Brian Catling, the Winchester Mystery House and Sarah Winchester are featured in a scene where one of the novel's several protagonists is tasked by Sarah Winchester to attend a séance and capture the spirits that will be summoned by the medium. In Michaela Rossner's 1993 science fiction novel, Vanishing Point, the Winchester Mystery House becomes the home of a squatter community following the disappearance of most of the human race. Conrad Bishop and Elizabeth Fuller's play, Hammers, features the construction of a fictionalized version of the Winchester Mystery House from the point of view of a carpenter whose entire working life is spent on the project. Several video games have also referenced the house. The survival horror game The Evil Within features a level in a Victorian mansion with bizarre architecture similar to the Mystery House. 8 Games created a game called Winchester Mystery House Escape, in which a team of carpenters are assigned to refurnish the Winchester Mystery House, and one is trapped inside. The player's goal is to help the carpenter escape. As you can see, most of the media inspired by the Winchester Mystery House focuses on the supernatural aspects instead of the tragedy behind its creation, propagating the myth that Mrs. Winchester was an insane woman who believed spirits were haunting her. It's often easier to take a story like that of the Winchester Mystery House at face value. Seances and curses are much more interesting, mysterious, and better for tourism than a grieving widow who just wants to be left alone. Our need for solution and explanation is often what drives us as humans to make up elaborate folklore, and many times there is a seed of truth at the heart of these tales, but it's covered up in rumor and fantasy. The only way that seed can grow and reveal its truth is for people like us to dig deeper and embrace our morbid curiosity. The Morbid Curiosity podcast was produced by H. Lloyd. If you'd like to get in touch or suggest a morbid topic for me to talk about, you can tweet the show @MorbidPodcast or find us on Facebook and Instagram @MorbidCuriosityPodcast. If you like the show, please share us on social media and give us a rating on iTunes. Your shares and ratings help us grow. Thank you to Jelly Sock for a great book recommendation about the nutshell studies of unexplained death, and to Shannon for recommending our show on Twitter. A thank you to Luke W. for bringing a video about the first human head transplant to our attention on Facebook. Thanks to you and many other listeners, our creepy community is growing. Speaking of our creepy community, the MCP is part of the Belfry Podcast Network. Check out the other shows on the Belfry Network at www.thebelfry.rip. If you'd like to support the MCP, you can go to our website, www.morbidcuriositypodcast.com. There you'll find a donation button, links to all our social media, and other ways to contact us. Your donations help us keep the podcast going. We really appreciate your support. My name is Hallie, and until next time, thanks for listening.